Great, thank you. Thank you, Falguni. What a pleasure, what an absolute pleasure. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to Unrehearsed Futures community folk, and especially welcome to anyone who is new to this space. Thank you so much for joining us. Just so you have can kind of orient yourselves around what this is. Unrehearsed Futures was started about 3 years ago by Jehan Manekshaw, who has just stepped down as the head of the drama school of Mumbai. And in response to the pandemic, he really wanted to just be in conversation with other people for whom, you know, all of the questions that the pandemic had thrown towards the theatre and performance space, he really wanted to, you know, be in conversation with other people about how to be in the moment that we were presented with and how to do things differently. And so he invited Amy Russell, who runs an organization called a training space called Embodied Poetics. And they co-curated a series of conversations with wise and wonderful people who were grappling with similar questions. And myself and Mbongenim Charlie are the two other curators who joined last year. And we're both based in Cape Town at the Center for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies. And with this, the space to be in conversation with people all over the world about how to be at the nexus of theatre and performance, broadly speaking, pedagogy, activism, and all kinds of other things together in a way that is, you know, I guess we're still asking how to do things differently in many ways. And so we host these conversations at the moment, more or less every other week. And yeah, this is who we are. And we kind of rotate who it is that hosts each of the sessions. And it is my unbridled, deepest pleasure to be in the conversation today with Kate. And part of what is so deeply pleasurable is the fact that we've known each other for almost 3 decades. And I know, I saw that gasp there, Alex. Yeah, exactly. Almost 30 years have our friendship spans 30 years coming up. And we met in an audition for Romeo and Juliet when we were like 18 at Northeastern University. And Kate played Lady Capulet and I played the nurse. And I have this like overwhelming recollection of Kate hauling around these massive art history coffee table books while she was learning her lines. And we became fast friends, fast, instant friends. And I think partly because we were kind of nurturing this like growing love for live performance together at the same time. And in retrospect, I also think that we might also have been wanting to like push against something unnamed, I think at the time, but you know, it's so interesting to have such a long friendship to reflect on. And over that, since that time, since we met about 30 years ago, we've kind of done a kind of concertina, you know, negotiated proximity and distance. She has, you know, traveled and ended up in New York. Obviously, I find myself in South Africa, and we have kids, we have partners who both happen to be lawyers, don't need to talk about that. And we are, you know, we kind of find each other coming back together and then moving apart and coming back together and moving apart. And we've recently kind of come back together again around, again, seems like asking similar questions about how to navigate this, you know, what I called in a chat to Kate, a kind of holy trinity of art making, educating, and parenting. And this space that, you know, as you can imagine, if it's not the space that you also occupy, is full and fraught and interesting. And how one navigates this space with lushness and generosity and spaciousness is part of what we're going to talk about today. So welcome. Here we are. The chat is open. Feel free to comment and ask questions and say what you need to say. It will be ongoing. Typically how we run these sessions is that Kate and I are in a kind of back and forth with each other for about 40 minutes or so. And then we open it to the room. We can stick to that or not. So please come on in with your, at any point that you have something to say, please make it known. Kate, Hi.
My friend.
Hi,
Morning.
my friend.
What a delight.
What a total delight. I want to start by asking you where you are, how you are, and how you want to introduce yourself today.
Thank you so much. So I'm on the 11th floor of Building 77 in the Navy Yard. If I look to my left, I see the East River. This building is part of this big complex that used to build weapons and munitions for war. And it's wild to think about, particularly in World War II, like bombs getting built here, and a lot of women in Brooklyn like having their first jobs like maybe in this room feels pretty heavy, but in a kind of energizing, strange way to know that this building is now full of artists and filmmakers and photographers and musicians. It's kind of a lovely layered history to hold. I put in my identification there on Zoom that this is also Lenape land. I think a lot about, like I said, just these sort of like parallel stories from the past, but stories that are still very much present. And so I really try to be mindful of, who was here before, who was stewarding this land before people who look like me showed up. And I'm on this sort of little patch of earth and water where my trajectory, I kind of make this loop daily of being in Brooklyn, which is where I live, where my studio is, and being in Lower Manhattan, which is where my school is that I helped to co-found, and where my own kids go to school in another school nearby, and where some of the organizations that I collaborate with are located. And so I'm constantly going back and forth across the river and realizing recently that river crossing has a big kind of role to play, I think, in my practice and how I move through the world. And that proximity to water and light and air on the river really matters to me, and how I go through my days. So that's where I am. And who I am, if I'm trying to think about introductions, I think like a lot of the folks in my circle, I know, like you, Munya, and other folks that I know on this call, my identity is hybrid and multiplicitous. I wear a lot of hats. It's kind of like a kaleidoscope in here. I'm an artist. I helped to start a school. I'm an educator. I'm actually in my second week of my 20th year as a classroom teacher, making art with young people. Again, math is mind-blowing to me these days. I sing with a chorus of women and non-binary activists. It's a chorus that kind of sits at the intersection of music and activism, raising our voices in the spirit of joy as an act of resistance, which comes from a poem by Toy Derricott. And I also am a mama. I have 3 kids. They're 9, 11, and 13. And as I name all these things out, even for me, it's like kind of overwhelming. Like that is a lot of things to sort of do at the same time. And I think it's taken me a while, before the call started, we were talking about how long we've known each other, talking about this experience that I'm having of sort of moving into middle age. So I think that's also important to name as part of my identity, that I'm in my late 40s. And part of my identity is also holding a lot of tenderness for the 36-year-old version of me, and the 24-year-old version of me, and the 12-year-old version of me that all feel very much alive in me, and who I think probably are feeling a bit bewildered about what the 48-year-old version of me is sort of up to right now. It feels sometimes kind of unwieldy to be doing all these things, and yet as I kind of move into this point in my life, I'm starting to kind of braid together the questions that are tugging at me in all of these different spaces, and beginning to get a kind of a glimmer of coherence.
I love that. I love it. Thank you. Okay, so we, fortunately for ourselves, put a question in our description that we are going to use to orient our conversation, because it feels like one that could mushroom beautifully. And so I'm just going to kind of remind us of the question, bring it into the room, and then ask you maybe to tease out some terms, yeah, so we can kind of get into what we're going to talk about. So the question before us today is, how might we peel away from the clattering world and drop into the summoning world and commit to doing so over and over and over again, despite all the reasons not to? Here we are. So to start us off, to kind of deep dive into this, what are we talking about? What are you talking about when you ask this question? And particularly, what are these terms? What do they mean for you? How have you come to, I don't want to use the word define because that feels strong, but yeah, how do these words land for you? They're particular, you've chosen them with such care that it would be great to understand what they are for you, what they do.
Yeah, I love that framing of that question. Well, they're both borrowed terms, I should say. I really care a lot about lineage and sort of, you know, how those of us who are kind of asking these big questions across all these different disciplines, you know, where we're finding the sources of our thinking. And the clattering world is a term that I've heard Clarissa Pinkola Estes use a lot. She's the woman who wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves. And the summoning world is a little piece of language that I came across in a passage by Mary Oliver in a book of hers called Blue Pastures. And so those two terms for me have become shorthand. And I'll spiral into each one in a moment. I want to say at the outset, I was thinking about this morning, that I think one of the great challenges of our time is to begin to think beyond the binary, right? And we see that, I see that come up a lot around conversations about gender, about conversations around our very polarized politics. Like, how do we coax ourselves into a synergy between ideas that can feel opposing? So I want to name that at the outset, that this, I'm about to talk about binaries, right? Like, I'm about to define these terms that have these kind of like magnetic pole energies. And then the idea, I think, is how to figure out how to navigate the space between them, how to bring them together into some kind of balance, doesn't feel right, but kind of like a dynamic dance. So I think the clattering world for me is this kind of the world that most of us are forced to live in most of the time. It's the world of to-do lists, just stuff that we have to do. You know, you got to take your kid to the doctor. You have to write your lesson plan. You have to text people to make sure that this thing happens so that other thing can happen. You have to remember if you bought avocados. You have to figure out your responsibility to that thing. Oh, did I message her back? I forgot. No, I forgot. Shoot, what's that thing? This thing happened on social media. That feels like, oh, I should probably respond to that quickly. And right. And so it's like this kind of, for me, it's like this very frenetic attempt to kind of keep the wheels on. And particularly, I think for people who navigate lots of different spaces, I feel like I'm always right on the verge of messing up and like setting a catastrophe in motion if I don't have it all handled, which is an internal feeling, but it's also true sometimes. Like if I miss that text, then there's a child that's like waiting to be picked up that thinks that they've been abandoned. So it's like a bit high stakes. And then more broadly, it's capitalism, right? It's this external voice that's telling us that we need to be X amount productive in order to kind of earn our right to be human beings and breathe in the world. It's that voice that tells us that we're not doing enough, we're not making enough, we're not logging enough, we're not measuring our worth enough. It's that staticky kind of place. And for me, the clattering world like exists from like shoulders up. It's a very like this kind of space. And then in contrast, and I have to like take a breath because it stressed me out talking about that. So on the other side, like the opposing pole is what Mary Oliver calls the summoning world. And for me, that's an idea of, and it's a less an idea, actually more an embodied experience of following the tug of a longing, of being in communion with a creative spirit, allowing yourself to be kind of led by instinct. When I'm in the summoning world and I know that I'm having that experience, my sense of linear time falls away. Another binary that I think is very useful to kind of pull into this conversation is the Greeks had a distinction. They had two words for time: chronos time, which for me is like clattering world time, to-do list time, check off the checklist time, and then kairos time. And in kairos time, you're so absorbed, you're so given over to the lived experience that chronos time melts. You're in the spiral, you're in the vortex, you're up against the skin of the world, you know? And so for me, art making feels very situated in the summoning world. It feels very situated in kairos time. And when I think about longing lives in that world very powerfully. And yet most of us are walking around and moving around in a space where those sensations don't often fit. Like, it's just hard to, at least for me, to hold the thread of those feelings and those lived experiences in a world that's really telling me to not go there, that it might be dangerous to go there. And I think the last thing I'll say about that sense of perceived danger is that I think that over the course of history, that's been a sometimes gendered sense of danger. I think back to both of my grandmothers were artists, and neither one of them had an opportunity to really fully live into their bloom as artists, if you want to say it that way. And in both of their cases, I won't get deep into their lived experiences, but my grandmother on my dad's side used to write poetry. And when I asked her about it as a young girl, she said, "Oh, no, don't," I said, "I'd love to read your poems, Grandma," and she said, "Oh, don't be silly. I burned them when I got married." And I remember being just so stunned by that, this idea, and she said it in this just absolutely offhand way, like just casually, like, no, darling, don't be silly, right? And I felt like internalized. I was probably 12 or 13 when we had that conversation. Just this sense that a woman writing poetry couldn't possibly fit into the matrix of what it meant to be a wife and a mother at that time. So I feel that dichotomy in this very powerful lived way, just even in terms of my own family's lineage.
Oh, thank you. I love the story about your grandmother, because it's so, like, you feel it in your chest, And I mean, speaking of feeling things in your chest, it also is, you talk about the clattering world and then needed to take a breath because the clattering world had like come into your body. And I'm so aware of the like embodied experience of the clattering world. And, we'll get into hopefully the what the embodied experience of the summoning world is, to reach for this other way of being in one's body, even, that these are, I love your description of these words and what they mean to you. And I want to ask you actually to go back to longing, because you mentioned the word longing a number of times in connection to the summoning world in particular. And I know that you orient yourself around this word in a very particular way. So please flesh that out for us.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I've been really playing lately with this distinction between longing and desire. I think about longing less as a desire for a specific person, place, or thing, and more as a yearning for this kind of what I feel is like an electrified field of presence that's just like just beyond my peripheral vision. And I want to be really clear that I don't think there's anything wrong with desire, right? Like, sometimes you have a desire to like connect with an ex-lover, or like move to another city, and or like go to a concert and stand in a field with 100,000 other people and listen to music while you're just blazed. And like, I think that's really great. Like, I'm very pro sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and like there will be no kind of puritanical hectoring for me in this conversation. Sometimes you just have to act on your desire, period. And yet, I also want to name that for me, I've had these lived experiences where I can get a desire met, And I'm still left with this ache that's unseen, right? Like that there's this pain that I'm left with even after I get the thing that I thought I wanted. And that has taught me over the years to ask myself questions. Like when I feel that desire, that grasping to get that thing, is there perhaps a longing that's underneath it that is maybe more expansive, that's maybe truer? Like a personal experience of this is many, many years ago, I came very close to blowing up my marriage because of this absolutely consuming desire to be with somebody else. And like crush doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what this was. Like this was like, I couldn't control it. This desire was so powerful and I got so close to just like lighting my entire world on fire. And mercifully for all involved, at the 11th hour, I realized that in fact, that what I thought was desire to merge with this other human being was actually a longing, because that person was an artist and was living out this creative journey in a way that I longed to do and didn't know how to even begin to name or reach for. And that realization saved a lot of heartbreak, although it was a very heartbreaking time. It gave me the tools that I needed to start to ask those deeper questions, right? Like if I have this longing or this desire rather to like, okay, like I can't handle living in the city. I'm moving. I've got to just like go to another place. Like I have to go to another city, right? Like maybe I do need to act on that desire. Maybe I should move to Paris, right? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Like perhaps that's the move. But there's this like discernment of like, do I need to move to Paris? Or in fact, do I need more space and light in my daily lived experience? Do I need to slow my pace and give myself more time to walk slowly and notice what's in my surroundings, to pay attention to light and color on buildings? Is that actually the longing? Or is there some deeper resonance? The idea I think that I want to say is that if a desire is a cue to act, like a craving that can be met or a thirst that can be quenched, longing is a landscape. Longing isn't asking you to do anything. It's asking you to be with it and listen to it and give it space and to see then what emerges and then to follow that. And it's a very subtle distinction sometimes, but it's been so generative to me to learn how to ask myself that question. Under that desire, under that grasping, is there in fact a longing? And what does that longing need to tell me?
I love this dance between longing and desire. And it really, I mean, when you speak about them in that kind of relationship with each other, they so, like they click together. It's like two puzzle pieces of that feeling, one of which is like a drive to act, as you say, and the other one of which is like a pulse check or something. It's like a kind of, I don't know, like a like gauge or a reminder to like ask the desire some more questions before you jump on the plane to wherever, So I love that they are so they feel really like sympathetic towards each other too, like they are like kind forces in relationship, or at least longing feels like it can make desire quite kind, gentler, makes things gentler. I love it. And I want to ask, there's, I think someone also in the chat, Susan, it was you who has also said, Susan, would you like to, if you're still here, do you want to read this out and kind of jump into the conversation? If not, I'm happy to. Okay, I will. Yeah. So Susan here, go for it, Susan.
Oh, you're muted, love.
I apologize. I had to go to the bathroom. Say
Oh,
again
good.
what you just said, the thing that I put in the chat. I was, what did you just say? So I can, because I was a little out of
I was
order,
just inviting you to read what you put in the chat out and to come into the conversation if you wanted to.
Oh,
That's
okay.
where we were. Yeah.
So I will just say this about I know Kate in a physical way, in that we live in the same place and we've connected in this kind of, I get chills just when I see Kate. I walk in the world and I see sparkles on buildings and I'm like, Kate is living in the world. So, I mean, you all know I love sparkles, as I do. And we've shared, some intimate space together. So I wrote in the chat, which is talking about longing, with the Chronos time and the Kairos time. I was like, oh my God, that just is so visually, physically, really descriptive. And it resonated with me. And I just thought longing, and I was thinking about longing, not as opposed to desire, because I related to that, feels like it can also live in the space in between those two times, that even though you're in that clattering time that Kate was describing, that longing, and maybe it's where the desire is that attaches to the longing, the awareness of the longing, that helps you go back into that other time, or keeps you always aware of that the Chronos time. So I said longing feels like it can also, that it lives in the between the times, as a bridge or a map to guide one back from the Chronos time into one's Kairos time. Or did I?
No, you're right.
Those.
That's it.
Okay, I did.
Got
and then
it.
I, responded to longing as a landscape, that Kate said. So very
Love it.
generous feelings.
There's also, Susan, something you're saying, Kate, that I want to kind of ask you about, and it's the longing. I'm wondering how the longing, it becomes generative, right? Like what it is about the space of longing that is generative, and what that looks like for you. We've talked about sparkles on buildings, so I feel like we're kind of edging that way anyway. But you have some very particular, specific practices as an artist, educator, parent that you have cultivated for yourself towards this space, right? So we can talk about this in theory, and it's beautiful, but we are at the end of the day, there is something about being very purposeful about how one does different things in the world, and you have done that, and I'd love for you to share how and what those things are.
Yeah, so there's a lot of threads to weave together here, and I want to talk about those really specific practices which I love this notion that Susan teased out, the idea of the bridge between the two worlds. Because it's not just like flipping a switch, right? If it were, it'd be so easy, but that threshold is the thing that's often very tricky for me to navigate. Because there's nothing inherently wrong with being in Chronos time, and checking things off a checklist can feel very satisfying. And similarly, although in a very different embodied experience, Kairos time, or this creative space, is also, once you're in it, once I'm in it, it like flows and it has its own intelligence, and I'm just like following the flow of it. But the transition, the threshold, like how do I get myself over the edge? And when we talk about resistance, right? There's another binary to tease out, right? There's political resistance, which is rising up in the face of oppression. But then there's this internal resistance that wants to kind of keep us in one state or the other. And at least my experience is it can be quite rigid. It doesn't want me to cross that threshold. It's like, no, we've got momentum in this one place. Let's just stay here. And so kind of coaxing myself over the threshold is really the trick of it. And so there are a couple of different, just like practices that I use. You talked about light on buildings, and as I walk, I find that I think much more vividly and in a much more embodied way when I'm in motion. which I also want to talk about in the context of education and pedagogy in a minute. So I'm going to bookmark that and put that over here, but let's not forget about that. But just in my lived experience, if I sit down and I try to write something and I'm in that Chronos brain and I'm in that clattering world brain, there's a perfectionism that comes with that is learned behavior because of, you know, my schooling. It's like you have to get an A+, you have to get a gold star. And so if you're going to sit down to write or to create, it better be very good. And then the added pressure as a parent is not only must you get a gold star and an A+, but you're also paying a babysitter to take care of your child while you try to do this thing. So now it better be extra good and worth that however many dollars an hour you're paying that babysitter, right? And the guilt that you might feel. I mean, there's layers, right? And so to get over that hump, and particularly to move into a creative and a generative mindset when you're in Chronos time is very, very tricky. And so the bridge practices that I have are really designed to help me keep the hum of the longing, to keep the hum of the Kairos time alive in me, even in those moments where I perhaps can't get to the studio, can't get into that headspace, so that even as I'm walking down the street and perhaps, you know, taking that child to the doctor or going to buy the avocado that I forgot to buy for dinner or doing the clattery world checklisty type behavior, I'm at the same time coaxing myself to notice things. And the light on buildings, this is just quite an arbitrary thing. For me, there's something really pleasant. You know, I love a good tree shadow, who among us does not? Tree shadows are great, but I specifically love when light reflects off of windows onto other surfaces, other buildings. And there's a few reasons I love that. One is that it's a trick of light that comes off a very hard, flat, often rectilinear surface. And then it morphs into this blobby, splotchy, wavy, strange, what I call kind of like a sun glyph. Like they look like these like wobbly languages of light. And I just find them beautiful. And I love the rhythmic quality of them. I've started to kind of create this informal mental map of my neighborhood. And I know that if the sun is out, at a certain time of the day and at a particular, you know, point in the season, there will always be that particular sun glyph on that particular wall. And it will always look different. It's never the same twice, right? So there's this lovely kind of like tug between the predictability of it and the instability of it that I find really just pleasing. But truly the point of it is to give my monkey mind a little thing to look for out of the peripheral vision, right? To give my head and my heart and my body space to be in Chronos time. Sorry, Kairos time, to be in that kind of like rich, lush, longing space. So that even if I'm not actively creating, even if I'm not in the studio and I am not making art, there's still a hum of that summoning world that is just right under the surface of my skin, so that when I do get back into the studio, or I do sit down to write, or I do sit down to make art, I'm not whiplashing back from like the absolute opposite of the muse. I've got it close. I've got it like, just right there, like, yes, okay, thank you. Let's just pull that up now. So it makes the transition, it makes the journey over the threshold just a little less staticky, a little less full of friction.
I was just putting in the chat here after what you just said that, you know, the hum of the summoning world becomes so much more accessible if it's thought of in this way, right? If the summoning world is a place that is all around us. And I love this idea of it being in your peripheral vision, because that also requires a different kind of attention. That is not a direct gaze. That is not like gunning for the subway. That is you're walking differently, and it's softer. It's like soft focus for the theater people in the room. You know, it's soft focus and peripheral. Like what floats into view. And as soon as you turn maybe to look at it too directly, it also slips back out. You know, so it's got all of the qualities. It feels like quite a kind of trickster, like a playful trickster space that is accessible, that is like, you know, if one longs for, is in one's daily reach. I mean, this is what is particularly, you know, kind of just resonant for me, is that, as you say, the threshold, getting over the threshold of the daily clatter is a feat of note. It like is Herculean, in fact, you know, often it just feels like there's no possible way to get over the other side of whatever the oncoming avalanche of to-do list is. So there's something so calming, actually, about thinking about it as very accessible and not dependent on the avalanche landing on you and you surviving the avalanche. You know, it's not like, well, you got to ride the wave and survive the thing, survive the tornado, and then maybe you can find a little glimpse of something. This is something different altogether. This is about what is in reach. And that feels quite radical, actually, you know, the fact that it's yeah, there's something that is like really available in a way that is yeah, that, you know, the kind of product driven world would rather we didn't know.
Well, that's exactly it. And it reminds me, you know, I said I was going to put a pin in the piece around pedagogy and education. And so to weave back to that thread, Monia, do you remember Nancy Kindelin's, was it a green chair? Was her green velvet chair? Do you remember this? Yes. So we had a professor in college in the Dear Dead, in what my very lovely, sweet and well-meaning student recently referred to as the late 1900s, which I found to be very confronting. Unironically, just like, oh yes, I was happening in the late 1900s. So yes, in the late 1900s, Professor Nancy Kindelin had a green chair in her office, and she would summon you to the green chair. She would make you sit in the green chair, and she would ask you these big, open-ended questions. What would you like to do with your life, and what do you care deeply about? And she never actually said, what do you long for? But this was the subtext. And I used to loathe being summoned to the green chair, because after 18 years, or well, I guess whatever, 15 years of education, I'd gotten very good at answering questions. And I was always getting the A+ and the gold star and feeling very affirmed in my intelligence and, you know, medal as a student. And then here I would sit in this green chair and be utterly paralyzed and flooding with fear about these big open-ended questions about what I cared about and what I longed for and what I wanted to create. And I realized that the reason that I was good at answering all of those questions in the years of schooling that led up to those terrifying moments were that they were always phrased as yes/no questions. Can you comply with the directions I have given you? Yes, I can. Can you demonstrate mastery on the task that I have defined for you? Yes, I can. Can you carry out the step-by-step instructions for the project that I have created for you? Yes, I can. But no one at any point ever said, what would you like to create? How would you like to define this question? What matters to you? What do you long for? Right? I had no muscle memory and no practice at figuring out who I was or what mattered to me, right? And here I was at 18, about to graduate, maybe 20, about to graduate from college and step out into the big wide world with no experience of that. And so I think a lot about now as an educator, what is my responsibility? In what way do I get to open up spaces where young people get to be in that space of longing? How can I usher in those big questions about what matters to you? Who are you? What is tugging at you? Not, can you demonstrate mastery? Can I give you this grade, this transactional form of education that I was taught how to do in grad school? You know, these are the way, this is, and so my friend Kamau, who runs an incredible organization called Black Gotham right across the river, it's like right there. He's also an extraordinary thinker, and when I say also, what I meant was he's also an educator. He's an extraordinary thinker. And he makes this distinction that I think is very powerful between education and pedagogy. And he says that there's no accident that the word pedagogy has as its root ped, which is foot, right? And I believe he's pulling from some thinking by Rebecca Solnit about walking and learning and education. But the idea that pedagogy is designed to be, and he tells a story about the Romans who thought about learning as something that happened while people were walking together. And there's something about that notion that learning, if it is to be as vivid as we know is possible, must be an embodied experience. It can't just happen from the head up, and it can't just be something that we predefine and then transact and then measure compliance with. It must be a shared, embodied, evolving experience. And it must involve some of those questions that I used to wriggle out from underneath in that big green velvet chair. That if I'd had a bit more experience with answering them, I might not have been so afraid of that. It was that very volatile threshold space. She was asking me to like step into the longing, step into the summoning world. And I was like, no, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't know, I might get it wrong. I might mess it up, right? And so how can we teach our young folks really explicitly like, hey, no, come forward into this messy space with me. And I, as the teacher, am here with you, figuring it out as I go along. And I'm not dispensing wisdom from on high to you. We can all Google the answer. If we need to get a quick date or a fact, like we all have access to that really quickly. That's not a problem. And we can fact check ourselves and we'll be really rigorous and make sure that we're on point. But the bigger questions of what are we doing and why, like, I don't know the answer to that. We got to do that together and figure it out. And that becomes really fascinating to me about how are we teaching young folks about this bridge between these two states? How are we teaching them how to define their own practices? They might not care about light on buildings. That's just the myth that maybe, you know, I don't need to enforce that on anybody else, but how can I ask them, what is that thing that you're really fascinated with that can be your cue to drop in away from the clatter and into the longing and into the summoning world? And that to me feels like a really interesting place of inquiry.
Oh, Alex, I'm so glad you put something in the chat because I've been thinking about you as Kate has been speaking. And partly because Alex and I share, I guess, an evolving, ongoing relationship with various problematic institutions in South Africa. And Kate, as you were speaking, you know, so much of what I was thinking about, and Alex, you're coming to mind, is that part of the clatter is the design of these spaces, you know, the kind of you know, I hear everything you say when you ask this question about how to bring young people closer to their own summoning world. And I long, in fact, to be able to be in a teaching, learning, education, arts-centered space, however you might, you know, use those terms, in a way that provides that facilitates exactly that. And, you know, I find myself so pulled. I keep leaving universities. I'm there for 4 years. And as soon as I have tenure, I'm like, forget it. It's too much structure. It's over. I'm going. And then I go and then I wander back. And so there's clearly, you know, like there are resources in these places that are very guarded. That's the whole thing. And there are, you know, there's a kind of gathering of minds and energy and incredible things with such potential. And then we go box the shit out of that thing, right? And have it accessed only in particular ways, grade the, you know, like all of the kind of clattering structures arrive to quell any kind of opening towards summoning. And then we make work on the floor, right? Because we know that in the rehearsal room, something towards that is possible. Yeah. And we tune out the fact that we've got to grade them at the end, but there's something in the rehearsal space for me when you talk. I'm also at the beginning of a process now with a group of students, so it's feeling very present. But there's something else happens in there. You know, those of you who are theatre and performance people and who work with young people might know that is, you know, similar maybe to when one is kind of finds a sweet spot in their own practice, unsuspectedly, that And it's about doing something very much together and walking towards some very deep unknown territory, feeling held and able to do that work. And so my deep ongoing frustration is the fact that those moments feel so hard to come by and guarded, you know, like preciously guarded, because the clatter of the institution is often so loud. So I guess, I mean, I'm not sure this is a question, but I guess I'm really resonating with what the possibilities are for the kind of teaching learning space here, and how to open space for young people that is just more spacious than what they are confronted with when they, you know, often walk into a kind of school learning environment.
Yeah.
Alex, did you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Kate, go for it.
Well, no, I'll just say, and then I want to, come back to Alex's question, which I think is so crucial, is those questions are so present for me because I started my formal teaching experience at a school in the South Bronx that was a very traditional charter school. I'm talking kids lined up in size order for some unknown reason, standardized tests, really drill and kill type, you know, just rapid fire memorization. Let's just completely transactional. And I loathed it and I was about ready to leave, but through a fluke, I ended up teaching theater. And as you describe, I realized like, okay, when no one's looking, I can tap into this little glimmer of magic. And I realized quickly that the theater itself, like the let's put on a show, was almost like a Trojan horse. Like, I don't care. Musical theater is just such a strange art form. So, you know, when people first meet me, like, oh, you make musical theater with kids, you must love musical theater. Like, and they'll send me, and I'm like, I really don't love musical theater. It's just so weird and awkward and like mostly super problematic. Like, that's a whole other story for another day. But what I love about it is it gives us this structure in which we can move towards some of that glimmer that you're describing, some of those unscripted, unrehearsed moments that just emerge in those spaces when it's 3 days to opening night and we have to solve a problem and the costume is falling off and the light is falling down. And yet, oh my gosh, this little like glowing orb of a bit of goodness emerges and a kid who's been blocked opens and somebody else gasps, and it's just like, that's the thing that's sublime. And often that happens not because of the institution, but in spite of it. And so from that thought, I, with a couple of colleagues and naively not knowing how hard it would be to start a school from scratch, we thought, well, what if we build an entire institution around that, that gasp? You know, kids are saying, oh, I don't like reading when they're in English class, but then they're grasping for the theater book, the monologue books. And we're going like, oh, well, let's create a school where they're learning to read through theater. And we've done that. And also, despite all of our incredible intentions and the way that we sometimes land on the mark and go, oh, look, there's our values in action. Like, this is really, we're thriving. This is amazing. For every moment that that happens, if you look at my inbox right now, it's like, well, the 8th graders are moving through the 6th grade hallway at a volume that's unacceptable, and we need to reroute them. It means that the 8th grade teachers are going to need to escort them to lunch, but that cuts into their planning time. So now they're pissed. And I'm like, clatter, 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 right? And yet we have to address those things so that we have space to be bodies moving through space and time in a way that flows, so that we have the possibility of that little beautiful thing happening. And that's a push-pull that I'll never get used to as, you know, as a part of a founding team of a school. It's just a constant toggling back and forth between those two headspaces. And in terms of Alex's question about the role of the clown in pedagogy, I think that's so right at the sweet spot of how do we, and this is probably a much bigger question, but I think a really valuable one, is that we've been taught that leaders cannot be clowns. Leaders must only exist in the clattering world. They must be serious, they must be transactional, they must be loud, they must be invulnerable. They must be able to measure their success in linear mathematical ways. They cannot be clowns. They cannot be tricksters. They cannot flow and move into these awkward spaces of inquiry and questioning and vulnerability. And yet, what if leaders were clowns, right? Like, what if we turned that idea of leadership on its head? What if we began to recognize that being vulnerable as a leader is a strength, not a weakness, right? That being in that space of storytelling, being in that trickster energy with the folks that we work with could in fact be transformative. And I think, you know, if there's any hope for the future, like of the planet, it will come, I think, when we finally realize that true leadership is not any of the things that we were taught to believe, but in fact sits in that place of playfulness and creativity and mystery. I think that's the thread that we have to follow.
So Krista and I and anyone else who would like to join are about to found the Trickster Leadership Academy.
Yes.
Feel free. Started here, folks. You heard it first on Unrehearsed Features.
I'm just
Krista, yeah, come on in. Come on in. Would you like to speak any of this that's in the chat? Jump into this conversation with us.
Good morning. Hello. I'm loving hearing all of the thoughts be processed and the reaction and the participation going on with everyone here. It's really energizing. What a great way to start the day. Yeah, no, the whole trickster energy thing, and then what I was reading this summer, I threw a quote in the chat, but Alex, you too, talking about like where's the role of the clown as an educator. And I think that the lessons that I learned from this tiny little book that I was reading on vacation that had these wonderful illustrations of this clown's journey, and the clown having two faces in a lot of the images of the laughter, you know, that separates him from the world, you know, performing for these audiences, but on the side, this laughter comes from a place of tears about his own life and his own journey, and this idea that you know, you're just flowing through it, and it's almost Buddha-esque in my mind of like not being attached to either, you know, world, and how can we reinvent that, as you were saying, Kate, as leaders, but also as role models for young people that we're educating, that we can, not in a mocking way, laugh at the world, you know, but it is healthy, I think, you know, as a person who has just been on the planet longer than maybe the young ones that are in front of me, to demonstrate laughing at myself, to take the risk, to be foolish, because you don't grow, you know, if you're not willing to step into maybe the ridiculous, maybe into the dangerous or whatever, but not get so hung up. And that's the part that I struggle with, is the not attaching, the not getting hung up, and the gold stars, geez, you know, and this sense of needing to achieve something. And it just was so peaceful to me to come across this little piece of literature and art at a time when everything feels so tumultuous. And I've known Kate for about the same amount of time as Monya, and I'm at the same crux in my life of career change and emptiness and all these other, you know, the apocalypse, all these things, you know, and it was helpful to me and peaceful to invite this idea of the joy like a river, that maybe, because I do so much stopping and reflecting and analysis and the academy and the schooling, all those things, and just the idea that it can flow through us like music, that maybe both of those worlds that we're talking about, that the bridge is connecting here, maybe it all can be part of that flow. Maybe, who says that we have to, you know, be part of Chronos time as much as we are? Can we find that peripheral? You know, Kate, when you said that the sun glyphs are at the same time predictable and there at this season, at this time, but are always changing too, you know, where else can we see it? How else can we be it? You know, those are, I have no answers here. I'm just questions. So that's what I have to share.
Very resonant questions. Yeah. So grateful for you.
I have to go already. Thank you so much. Just wanted to say bye.
Thank you so much for coming.
See you soon, Zandile. Thank you so much for that, Krista. You know, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about the summoning world as existing outside, you know, as existing very much in connection to a natural world. And I say that, and I also love the fact that, you know, your summoning world is like deep in, you know, the like most urban of urban cities. But it's outside, and it's on its, you know, it happens while you're on your feet. So there's a thought that I have there about, you know, how to reshape education spaces so that they are more on our feet. I mean, even amongst the structures, it's just purely buildings that we have now dedicated to particular activities. And since they're so, you know, no pun intended, like it's stuck in stone, they have large difficulty transforming, you know. So how much of the kind of, yeah, I guess the summoning world is also about leaving the building in some quite direct way.
Yes.
And yeah, just seeing what else the outer, what literally, quite literally what is out there, you know. I mean, it just sounds so crass and quite simple, but I think there's something, I don't know, there's something about just taking the thing outside already.
That's right. That's right.
I wanted to ask if you could tell us about tiny portals.
Yeah.
Again, as part of your practice towards summoning longing, beautiful things.
Yeah. So this was actually probably the first time that I intentionally devised a practice for myself. This happened about maybe 4 years ago. It started, and I just we'd gotten the school up on its feet. That was humming along. My kids were just sort of like barely out of diapers, and I was kind of like transitioning from the constant like just, oh my God, put your shoes on. No, keep your shoes on. You know, just like moving a little bit further away from that part of parenting and catching my breath a little bit and realizing that my own creative life had really atrophied. That here I was doing all this work with young people about creativity and art making, and yet I myself was not being creative and I was not making art. And I was overwhelmed with a bit of the panic that we've talked about, you know, that threshold space of like, oh, if I'm going to start this, then I better do it really well. Like, especially now I'm like late in my life, and well, now I better make something that really has, oh, this better be like political and meaningful, and I better have something really powerful and valuable to say that no one else is saying. And I just went, oh my gosh, that's too much. And I didn't want to shut down completely. And so I, again, okay, if that's the grasping desire, like what's the longing underneath? And it's so much simpler. It was just like this little voice that was like, just make a tiny thing every day. Just like give it simplicity and space. And so I had just been in a process of cleaning out books and giving away some of my kids' old, you know, baby board books and things like that. And I'd come across this novel that my dad had given me called The Moviegoer. And I had kept this book, even though I'd read it like 3 times. I'd carried it through Spain when I lived in Spain for a couple of years. And it's an older book. It hasn't held up perfectly. It's kind of like tricky and problematic in places, you know, happens with novels as they age. But there was this one little piece of the book, this one little quote that said, the main character was on this, what he called a search, and it was like capital S, search. And somebody in the book asks him to define the search. And he says, the search is what anyone would undertake if he were not sunk in the everydayness of his own life. To be aware of the possibility of the search is to be on to something. Not to be on to something is to be in despair. And I had underlined that as a teenager and then forgotten all about it, but had kept the book. And as I was going through books and thinking about which ones I wanted to give away, I just thought, I can't give that one away, but I've already read it. Maybe I'll paint in it. And I just thought, like, kind of from a reuse, recycle kind of thing. I don't want to throw it out, but maybe I'll reuse it. And the idea of painting on a page that was not white was great for my little perfectionist brain, because I couldn't mess it up. And it was a book that was, you know, destined for the trash heap, but I had saved it, so I couldn't mess it up. It was like that simple. And so I just started a daily practice, so that either in the morning, if I had a moment, or maybe after I got the kids to sleep, I would just sit and I had this book and I just started to paint in it and not try to make it mean anything. Like the whole challenge was just like, don't try to be political and have some big message. Just literally let your hand move, let your eyes go soft and your gaze get gentle, and just see what happens. And what I began to realize as I was going through the book and I stumbled back on that quote was like, oh, this tiny little opening is widening into a portal, and I'm now on the search again in a way that I had not been. I had been in despair because I had been sunk in the everydayness of my life. And just through this tiny practice of making a mess on these pages every day, there was like this little widening, and the summoning world was like, hey, we're still here. Come here. Come on. It's good. It's fine. We're not going to hurt you. You know? And so it was like a reviving, in a way, of this part of me that had really gone dormant, but had not died. Crucially, had not died. Was just quiet for a bit. And so I just kept going with it and kept going with it, and then started to realize that I was onto something. And a dear friend came one day to take some photos. I hadn't had a headshot in many years, and so that's why she was there, and the book was out, and she said, you know, forget the headshot. I mean, you're cute. Let me snap a picture of you. Fine, but let me really photograph this book. And so she made these portraits of pages in the book, and those portraits turned into what ended up being my first solo show in a little sliver of a space through an organization called Chashama, right in the thick of the pandemic. And interestingly, because I couldn't have an opening, there was no way to gather. We were all socially distanced at that time. The only way that I could ask people to come in and see the work was to come in one-on-one. I also did these Instagram lives, and one of the ways that Susan and I got to know each other was that she joined me. It was 10 conversations with 10 artists over the course of 10 nights. And Susan was one of those artists, which is a memory that I really cherish. But in the little gallery space, I set up a little velvet pink couch, and I invited people to come in, sign up for time slots, and sit on the little velvet pink couch. And it didn't occur to me until this morning when I was thinking about it, that that little velvet pink couch was a great corollary for Nancy's green velvet chair. Because what happened, and I was not grilling people or giving people the third degree, but what happened is that because we were in this really rarefied little space, and because for many of us, we hadn't been outside of our quarantine pods in a year, right? These were the first, and we would sit masked and distanced, but only just two people together in this little space. I would be off on a chair, the art was all around, and my friend, whoever came to visit, would be on this velvet couch. And what emerged from those conversations, all of it centered on longing. And people would just speak into the room what they were longing for, what they were missing, what they were hoping to move toward. And so often in the course of those days, the show was up for like 2 weeks. And I can't tell you how many times in the course of those days, people would say, sitting on the little pink velvet couch, you know, I've never said this out loud, but, or I've never told anybody, but I guess I'm in the portal, so I can just say it, right? And so people spoke like a longing to have a baby, and they have a baby now. Like this happened over and over again. Somebody had a longing to leave their job and start a new one. And I'm not assigning any like actual supernatural power to this couch or to this space or to this portal, but I do think that there's something so generative. You asked earlier about what is generative about longing. And I think that we live in a culture, you know, what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls the overculture. We live in a culture that just wants to squeeze that longing down and tamp it out of us. And so that radical act of giving longing breath and air and space and volume to be able to say out loud, I've never said this out loud, but it alchemized things in the actual lived world, right? And it did for me too. You know, I said things in that portal, in that little space that I had never said out loud. And things started to shift. That's how Sentinels came into being, was talking about this idea of doing this portrait project with women in my life and non-binary folks in my life. And so many other things that I had not dared to dream about. I would sort of speak tenderly in that little space, and then they start to take on a life of their own.
I love that you just threw sentinels in there because they're hanging gloriously behind you on the wall. And I wanted to, so we have about 5 minutes left of our time together, and then we have what's called an after party, at which anyone can stay and chat. The recording is off. You can like pour yourself whatever you need to pour and stay and hang out, and it's unmoderated and great. But before we get into the after party, for those who would like to stay, there's a conversation happening in the chat that I want to invite to be pulled in between Angela and Alex. Angela, about a project that you are busy with, it sounds like, with a group of vulnerable women and their children and other young people. And Alex has a response to that. And I wondered if you wanted to kind of pull that in the context, I guess, because it's about context, as Alex says in her response to Angela, that, you know, it's one thing to really desire to create these spaces for young people to show up in this way for themselves and to tune into something else, other possibilities. And then there's the kind of really important contextual piece. And, you know, Alex and I happen to be based here in South Africa, where, yeah, there's the context that young people in particular find themselves in are really difficult, you know. And so there's a kind of, I guess, just a question about how one holds space for what they come with and allow space for them to open into something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, please. I'm here full of uncertainty and question. I've been asked to help out this foundation that takes care of women who are victims of domestic violence and their children. And I gathered 2 other artists with me. So I have a lot of hats. I could sympathize with you, Kate, a lot. So I was there in the capacity of art teacher and theater practitioner. But the previous job I had before, project, was with women in prostitution. And I had brought in a drama therapist, and I wasn't allowed to go in the sessions, so I couldn't gather that beautiful space within my range of, you know, experiences. So with this one, I wanted to go through actual artists, not therapists. And I was wondering how it would be nice to bridge that initial phase where they're coming from such vulnerability to help them go into that longing when they are all suffering from PTSD.
Yeah, it's such an incredibly crucial question, and I resonate with it a lot because so many of the young folks that I've worked with, although their experiences might be different geographically, they might live in a very different place, but many of the young people that I've worked with over the last 20 years have experienced incredible trauma and violence and loss and grief. And the idea of asking somebody, what do you long for, is very charged for folks who've experienced trauma, because the answer to that question for them, if they were to be brave enough to answer it, is often like, well, you can't have it, right? And so there's a period in my experience of the opening moves being so crucially important, because the opportunity there is to establish a place where if they want to do something that they can, that they will be met, that they will be seen. And often my experience is that sometimes just the very simplest things of shared creation can go a long way toward opening up the space. And so rather than, you know, asking massive questions and getting into abstractions, if there's a simple creative goal that's shared, like today, we are only going to paint the backdrop together. We don't have to be vulnerable yet. We're not going to try to embody a new role or learn lines or do, like, we're literally, each of us has a can of paint and a paintbrush, and we just have to splatter the paint on the canvas. And we're going to just do that now. I'm thinking about Susan's practice that has a lot of physicality to it. And there's a relief and a release to just be able to have the autonomy of like, I am a person with a paintbrush and a can of paint in my hands, and I can make a mark, and I'm allowed to make a mess. And all these other people around me, including the facilitator, we are all making this mess together in service of this shared piece. And I think that doing very physical work, again, this is just my experience. I don't have a PhD to back this up through research. It's just what's worked for me is like, before I get deep into the weeds of let's be vulnerable and, share our life stories together, it's just like, what physical task can we complete together to have the experience that we can trust one another, that we can say we're going to be a part of a thing that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and then we'll step back and say, we did a thing together. Look, it didn't have splatters before, but now it has splatters. Oh, and look, and then on the dark side over here, it blends into the light side. Should we hang it this way? Or should we hang it that way? Let's have a vote. What does that mean in our community? So I'm being silly and just kind of riffing on this idea, but I think to ground things very simply in the concrete first and help people live, don't tell them, right, that you are trustworthy, but help people live through the experience of like, oh, she said we were gonna splatter, and then we splattered, and now we've splattered. Okay, perhaps she's a person who can do what she says she's going to do. And now the nervous systems are like, right? And 3 or 4 more sessions in, now maybe we're ready to think about who's playing which role or what lines are,
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Mhm. We spoke to the women before, so we asked them what it is that they would like to do, and there was a huge range of things. So from music to art to fashion, so they have interests. And the idea is to showcase their work, and they're valuable. Their mark is being left in the foundation when they move on. But yeah, I think the physicality makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Susan,
My
please
cat
come
came
in.
to join. That's
I
what's
love
Yes, I
funny.
love
it.
it. It's
Our
love
fellow
it.
Susan's got a hand up too.
She talks a lot.
Susan, go ahead. See that your hand is up. Would you like to come in?
I did want to come in, and now I got into that conversation that Kate was doing. Maybe I lost my train of thought.
All good. No worries at all. If it comes back, you can bring it into the after party.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think it was, I had wanted to text this when I had first read Angela's, what she put into the chat, but I was more, really involved in listening. So it was hard to kind of extract my own thoughts into the messaging. But I think it would be in line with, I am not a educator of others. I mean, I'm a self-educator, and I think that's how I've sort of grown myself up and survived. But what I have found in just the work that I do, that's I call it sort of like public work that's not formalized. And Kate kind of knows what I'm talking about. Like the thing that we did for the portals is just like in the moment, you walk in and you start talking to strangers and doing something in public, and then people join and conversations happen. But just that idea of not formalizing, what Kate was talking about, just splattering and things like that. Because this idea of curiosity, of giving this, of just, I don't know the right word, but to support others or another person or the people in that group, in Angela's case, to like, if you're curious and you want to pick something up off the ground and imagine what it is and all these kinds of things, like a 5-year-old. So I'm a 5-year-old at 63 years old. Okay. So imagine the 5-year-old curiosity, even the traumatized 5-year-old. We all have that kind of curiosity. And I guess encouraging that, which is a different version of what Kate was talking about, just splashing paint and just letting the periphery come into view and going down that without any kind of structure. I don't know, something like that is what I wanted to share.
Yeah, makes sense as well. So there is the element
you.
of physicality of non-structure, because this project I'm allowed to just be, but the other project, which is part of a science festival, I've been having to engage researchers so that they analyze how engaging it was, and so it's back to more, and I'm being given a plan, and it's a bit suffocating. It's very suffocating because they want to analyze at the end and prove what they did.
Yeah.
I don't know. So yeah, so I feel it's kind of the masculine of the way one does things, the logical and the squares. And so I want to create the wavy lines and the splodges and the smudges within that framework, at least with the bigger project. But this one with the domestic violence, I'm allowed more creativity. And I appreciate Susan and yours, Kate, as well. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Alex. Yeah, and Alex, we'll have this be our last question for our time together, our kind of formal recorded time, and then we'll after party, close up a little, and after party. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that I think we all have this tremendous capacity to play, and it's about, you know, in response to Angela's thing, is that it's finding the mode to allow people to play together as the initial bridge of trust. You know, and I've experienced that in all of our work. And if that play means the splodge, or if it means, you know, being silly as like the clown, I think that's vitally important as the way you start with the group. And just to say that I've worked in many contexts, and it always has amazed me how the group's first, if you're workshopping something, the group's first story is always the story of their victimhood. And as a theatre maker, I've always thought, no, but there's so many other stories. But often that's what they need to tell first. And that first telling is so important to release other stories. And that once people are released the range of stories as human beings we can tell, that is such a powerful, powerful place to be in. I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you. I think we should all go start a new school or something. I don't know, you know, make a, yeah, something.
I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Having done that.
I know. I was like, well, Kate will guide us on this one.
You go from the radical revolutionary rabble rouser to like, let's burn it down and start over. And then you build it and you go, oh God, do I have to run this now? Like, oh, right. We're finding our way. We're finding our way. It's not, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. And there's certainly moments where I feel like, okay, we are living into this vision. But I'm glad that I didn't know what I didn't know before we started, or I may not have gone down this road.
Fair. And, you know, if Jehan was here, some of what he would speak about, I think, is a kind of peripheral, you know, among the things that is like a peripheral thing that we can't quite look at directly, that may emerge out of Unrehearsed Futures, possibly, is something about school is strong. I mean, it feels kind of structured in a way that this isn't, but some kind of amorphous space that connects people and allows them collaborate and learn stuff together, maybe in non-physical synchronous, you know, kind of put all of the words together and is sustainable and maybe doesn't require bricks and mortar. But, yes, you know, what is so exciting about even thinking about it is the knowledge that there are incredible models to pick from, like the fruit from the different trees of how something like this might come into being is so delicious. And Kate, I don't know what to even say to thank you. I do want to ask you in closing, like a quick, whatever pops into your mind, and this is inspired by something Susan said. What are you curious about right now?
So you and I initiated our friendship with the soundtrack of Michelle Ndegeocello's first album back in 1993, Plantation Lullabies, and she's since put out a lot of different albums, and one of them is Comfort Woman, and there's a track on that album, which I think is called Come Smoke My Herb.
Yes.
And nothing against, smoking herb, but the lyric that I can't get out of my head from that track doesn't directly have to do with smoking herb. But the lyric is, do you believe that creation desires your devotion? Through murder and death, we squabble over pieces of the earth. The true beasts are those who believe in creation. Without mother, womb, or birth, be simple like the flower. And so my curiosity is twofold, is how do I honor my true beast and the true beast in the beautiful people in my circle? How can we give more energy and light and space to our true beasts who believe in creation? And how can I be simple like a flower in the clattering world with so much vying for my attention and my care and my time? Where is simplicity? How can I be simple like a flower?
Love it. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you all for being in conversation with us today. What a pleasure. Yeah, I think let's close it officially now and stand by for our next Unrehearsed Futures happens to be next week because our timing has gotten a little squonk. So now that you've signed up for this one, you're likely to automatically get the updates. Feel free to come back and hang out. This is the space. This is exactly what it does. And yeah, just really deep thanks for this morning, afternoon. It's just, I feel lighter, like walking into the world lighter. And I appreciate that very much because it's not a feeling that comes often. So thank you all. Feel free to hang out.